Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Rebellious Research Seminar Series with a guest I've been waiting for quite some time. I'm really delighted today to welcome Jimmy Hay. So Jimmy, the next hour or so is yours, and then we're going to do a Q&A towards the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agatha. Thank you for having me and for a bit of patience at the start here with some technical issues. I'm very grateful to Eduardo, who stood here, who wasn't in the office with me, but I'm now using his laptop, so this all works. So yeah, very grateful to him. Right, I will just share my screen as we've just tested. Include sound and screen. There we go. And play. Okay, excellent. So can we see that all okay?
Yeah, it's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, once again, thank you for inviting me, Agatha, and thank you everyone for turning up. I know it's getting towards the end of term and we've all got one eye on the Easter break. So I'm very grateful that anyone turned up to this. I'm going to be talking today about a project that I've been working on for a few years now. And it's around the kind of the portrayal or the representation of grief in fiction cinema. And it's a practice research project, 3 short films as part of this project. And I've got half an eye on rounding the project off with a feature film, although that is very much funding dependent. So we'll have to see how that goes. I am going to be building up to talk in a little bit more detail about the third of these films today, which is a film I've not talked about in any previous kind of research talks or conference papers or screenings. Which is a film provisionally titled The Night a Spanish Doctor Called. But before that, I am going to talk more broadly about the project. I'm going to be talking about the other 2 films that I've made and some of the kind of the research underpinnings, but also some of the, I guess, the slightly more personal underpinnings to the project. I have, it's not by accident that I've used the word auto-ethnographic approaches to grief in fiction filmmaking as the title for this. And I approach that with some trepidation because as soon as I start even thinking about saying, well, there is a kind of a personal resonance here, or I'm mining my own kind of history. It seems incongruous with a kind of objective academic kind of research project, which of course is not the case. Auto-ethnography is a very well established field of academia, but it's just not an area that I was expecting to kind of to go into. Yeah, let's see how it goes. So when I first, or I should also say as well, this is going to be a mixture of reading from pre-prepared text and slight riffing, where I'm going to say that adds a naturalism and is absolutely in no way, shape, or form indicative of me not being 100% prepared. So I'm just trying to create a rhythm to the presentation. So when I first suggested doing this talk, I deliberately asked Agatha if I could be put on as late in the series as possible, because my expectation was absolutely that I would have the third film in this project finished by that point. Unfortunately, life has got in the way and it's not finished. But that, I hope, makes this perhaps even slightly more interesting talk because I'm still kind of figuring it out. I do have a complete assembly edit, so I know the film. I know what it's going to look like. It just hasn't had its post-production yet. It's color grading and it's sound design and sound editing. And as I'll discuss, the kind of this one has got a slightly different exhibition process to the other films that I've made, which I'll discuss. So both versions of the film would be finished, and I would have some conclusions or feedback from the screenings that have happened to be able to reflect on. But I'm actually hoping that talking about the project more broadly here today, I'm hoping kind of the questions and the feedback and the discussion will actually help to inform the next steps and some of the reflections on the film. but I'm going to start by just introducing the wider project. So the film, The Night of Spanish Doctor Called, is the third of three short films I've made as part of a broader project exploring different approaches to empathetic and phenomenologically informed representations of grief and the grieving process. This project emerged from a reflection on films about grief and bereavement, and a tendency in these films to portray the experience of grief in a largely narrative based manner, offering what can sometimes be quite superficial or at the very least abridged depictions of grief that struggle to capture the lived experience in emotional, psychological, and physical terms. And I found this quite jarring because and I'm going to jump straight in with the personal reflections here. I started this project because I was experiencing quite a kind of painful and profound grief. I lost my dad 10 years ago, and 3 or 4 years after he died, I started watching a lot of films about grief. I kind of ventured tentatively back into watching anything even remotely emotional because I'd just been watching romantic comedies for 4 years. And I started to kind of notice with a lot of these films that and I should stress there's absolutely zero value judgment here, which is why I'm not actually going to mention any of the films that kind of really prompted this study, because I'm not saying that they're kind of doing grief badly, or in a way that's inappropriate. The point being that they weren't reflecting to me my experience of the grieving process. As part of this research, I found the quote from Sigmund Freud. I found that there was one feature about mourning which remained quite unexplained. This was its peculiar painfulness, and this was something that really surprised me about grief, was quite how much of a kind of a visceral, haptic experience it was. There was a physical element, and still is, to be honest, a physical element to grief that I hadn't expected, and then that got me questioning, well, why hadn't I expected that? And it kind of led me down a path of, well, is it just because I've not really seen grief portrayed that way? We all know that so much of the way that we experience the world is through the portrayals and the representations that we see, whether either in real life or in film and TV, or music, theatre, books. And it was the fact that it was surprising was itself surprising, and that I think led me down this path of this project. So in a number of these films that I was watching, I found that grief was more commonly used as an inciting incident within a broader story, or an emotional shorthand to quickly establish a key character at the start of the narrative. And inevitably, in many of these films, the character undergoes a journey as a result of their grief, be it a road movie or a buddy movie or a romance narrative, that follows the established three-act narrative arc and ends with them having learned much about themselves and others, and crucially accepted their loss and found themselves in a position to move on with their lives. And as a result, these screen depictions, I think, can actually be quite misleading, and potentially even dangerous, because they either negate the real impact of grief, or construct mourning as a process that, while temporarily painful, will incrementally and relatively quickly dissipate until one is essentially over it. And this is kind of encapsulated quite neatly by the phenomenologist Catherine Higgins, who wrote, while the aesthetic notion of closure is frequently invoked in connection with the needs of the bereaved, unrealistic aspirations towards closure can encourage expectations that actually harm the bereaved. So if we are consistently seeing films where all you need to do is, take up a new sport or start a new relationship or make a big change in your life, go and find a new job, and then your grief will be cured, you'll be fine, you'll be over it. There is, to a certain extent, it's, you can maybe, okay, well, it's harmless, it's just a movie. But actually, if you're watching that and then thinking, well, what's wrong with me? Why aren't I able to do that? Why does my grief feel so much different? Why does it feel all consuming? Why does it feel my entire life has turned upside down? Well, actually, that can be quite dangerous, and so this is what then kind of turned me on to phenomenology as a potential approach to explore some of these films. But also current grief discourses reveal that the grieving process is far more complex, far more complex and a far more multifaceted experience. As frankly, anyone who has suffered a bereavement, which unfortunately, I imagine almost everybody on this call probably has. It's kind of the one inevitability. And this will come as news to nobody, that it's a more complex and multifaceted experience than it's often portrayed. And so this project seeks to explore the potential for conveying grief in a more nuanced, authentic, and empathetic manner. And it attempts to do so through engagement with current grief literature and current grief discourse, through phenomenological reflections on the lived experience of grief and grieving, and also film theory, in particular, Gilles Deleuze's work on the time image and the any space whatever. It seeks to explore whether the formal elements of film can be used in a practice as research context to portray grief in a more authentic manner than it predominantly is in fiction cinema, and whether a phenomenological approach to grief can serve the filmmaking process in the creation of an empathetic aesthetic. So underpinning these inquiries is the assertion that Gilles Deleuze's writing on the time image and the any space whatever finds kinship or aligns weirdly well with both grief theory and in particular Colin Murray Parks's concept of the assumptive world, which I'll come on to in a minute, and phenomenological explorations of grief. And as such, it can help us better understand the potential for representing the disorientating and non-rational nature of grief in fiction cinema by providing a kind of, I think, quite an illuminating bridge between film theory, phenomenology, grief theory, and practice as research. But to contextualize this project a little bit further in terms of outputs, I'm going to briefly discuss the other two short films that have been made. And I'm actually going to play some short clips as well, because as I said at the start, I understand it's late in the term and nobody wants to hear me just talk for an hour. So I've got three nice kind of sizable film clips to play. So the first of these, the first of the three films was a film called Lost Property, which was a collaboratively made film, which I wrote and directed with Liesl Dawson, who's in the English department at the University of Bristol, and Natasha Rosling, who is a visual artist based in Bristol. And it was filmed in late 2019, and it was made collaboratively between academics, filmmakers, visual artists, but also grief and bereavement professionals. So it emerged from discussions between myself and Liesl and Natasha. And each of us brought our own kind of professional interest and personal experience of grief to the project, but the film also like a universal sense of grief by interviewing in the conception and the development stage of the project grief counsellors, palliative care professionals, dementia care specialists, and funeral celebrants. And I carried out these interviews, which were kind of qualitative in nature, and I asked participants to reflect on their sense of the lived experience of grief and the manner in which people experience grief differently, and the ways in which the type of death could impact on the experience of loss. I then shared these interviews obviously with permission, with Liesl and Natasha, and this then informed the creative process of developing the idea and the script for the film, in a kind of interdisciplinary, collaborative approach that I guess sought to explore whether multiple voices would offer a balanced and holistic perspective on grief, or would they universalize and then actually generalize and perhaps even just kind of make slightly redundant the grieving process in an unhelpful way. So yeah, I'm going to play a clip from Lost Property, if that's okay, just to have a little break. And fingers crossed the sound works okay.
I'm just going to put the kettle on.
So what are you doing to the boat?
Just upkeep, patching, cleaning. I don't have milk. Do you take sugar?
Yes, but that's fine.
So that's just a short clip from the film. And I guess just to pick out a couple of elements from that, some of the ideas that we were wanting to explore with this that came out of those interviews, but also our own reflections were, well, one was the the alternative perspectives on the same event. So here you've got flashbacks of a funeral scene being prompted by or being triggered by the reintroduction of these two characters for the character played by Danielle, and then by getting a sight of the bed that Joe's character sees as she's climbing up the ladder. But also this idea of working through grief. She talks about we've got this boat that's in dry dock. It's not in the water, and there's this constant kind of maintenance and upkeep and work and sanding and hammering and drilling and screwing that's going on. And this was something that came out time and time again, was this kind of this feverish sense of work and maintenance that seemed to take place when people were in the midst of a bereavement. So this was something that we wanted to explore. The second film of the project was a film called Nothing Echoes Here, which I know Agatha's already aware of, and has had to sit through, I think, a couple of very, very similar presentations on it. So I'll try to gloss over it quite quickly. But so it was a Brigstow Institute funded short film that this time I wrote, shot and directed myself. It charts the 36-hour period in the life of a woman and her two children following the recent death of her husband, their father. The characters in the story are fictional, but the film is informed by an auto-ethnographic reflection on phenomenological elements of grief. So taking my own experience of grief, and in particular elements of grief that I felt were less commonly portrayed in fictional screen depictions of the grieving process, I attempted to use formal elements of film language and performance in the film to portray grief in what I hoped would be an authentic and empathetic manner, prioritizing a sense of experience over story and narrative. The film also explores the role that space, in particular, kind of exterior and non-familiar space, plays for those grieving a sudden and profound loss. this film was shot in September 2021 at the fourth attempt because it was torpedoed by a combination of fairly serious health issues and COVID. We had three postponements. Sorry, two of the three postponements were due to COVID. But the shoot was resurrected in early 2021, and it was. This obviously had a kind of a production impact. Every time we had to postpone, we lost a little bit more money because we'd already committed some funds. And I guess I'm not going to dwell on that, but I did want to kind of touch upon it because I think one of the biggest problems that we have as practice researchers is being able to pay for these productions. Because making a film, even as kind of as lean and as efficient as you can possibly be, using equipment from your own departments and locations that you already know, it is a collaborative enterprise, and people need to get paid if you're expecting them to work on your film. And unless you're a kind of a single shooting, maybe documentary filmmaker with no human subjects in the film, a film is going to cost money. And this already had quite a modest budget. It was a £5,000 production budget, which I got in research funding. I would say at least a fifth of that was lost by the time we actually got to the shoot because of committed funds that couldn't be refunded. And obviously this budget had to cover all elements of the film, the development, pre-production, shoot, and all elements of post-production, color grade, sound mix, and sound design. So it was a very kind of stripped back and small crew. It was a crew of 11 people, only 8 of which were ever on set at the same time. But this was also by design. So from the outset of the project, it had been decided to work with as small a crew as possible, as much for creative reasons as for logistic reasons. One of these was the fact that the 2 child actors in the film, who were 7 and 9 respectively at the time, were acting in a film for the first time. I should put a side note as a caveat: these were also my own children, so logistically much easier, but in terms of directing, not always easier. But in early discussions with the producer, it was agreed that a smaller crew would kind of help Charlie and Elsie to respond naturally to the setups that we in the scenes that they were in, and like they were never given a script. They were never given any specific lines. There was just a setup of a scene. This will happen. Charlotte, the main actor, will do this, and I want you to react as you would normally in this situation. So I was really keen to remove as much opportunity for performance as possible to achieve the greatest sense of naturalism and authenticity. I also arranged for Charlotte, our lead actor, to come and live with us for a few days before the shoot. This was only supposed to be a couple of days, but then because of COVID, she ended up having to quarantine in our house for 10 days, which was probably rubbish for Charlotte, but it was brilliant for the production, because by the time we got on the shoot, the kids had probably spent more time with Charlotte than they had their actual mum in the previous 10 days. And so there was a kind of an ease of performance and a sense of naturalism that really helped. These kind of elements of the shoot as well were also why I decided to shoot continuously as opposed to having multiple setups. So it was very much a kind of an intuitive cinematography. I was the camera operator, and we'd run the scenes in full, and I would kind of find the shots. There wouldn't be lots of multiple setups. Right now we're going to move over here and I'm going to get the coverage. Now we're going to get the close up just on you. I would occasionally grab kind of cutaways afterwards, but I really wanted the kind of a sense of naturalism in the performance to be the kind of the primary element there. But also there was this sense of having very kind of lots of close-ups, constantly kind of shifting focus with a very shallow depth of field aesthetic to be staying on Charlotte as much as possible. And this was an attempt to kind of convey this real sense of interiority and claustrophobia and entrapment in the emotional state that the character is in. We also shot the film in a number of locations that were kind of free and known to me, including my own house. So there was a kind of an auteurist and auto-ethnographic element to that as well. Anyway, I'm going to play a quick clip from that film now. Okay. Okay, so yeah, that was a clip from Nothing Echoes Here. Again, the in terms of some of the kind of the auto-ethnographic approaches, the one of the first ideas I had that I knew I wanted to be a scene in the film was the kind of the impact of music as a trigger, and this was kind of directly taken from the drives to work that I had to do in the months following the death of my dad, and the impact that it was. I mean, no one will be surprised to hear a Nick Cave album, "Push the Sky Away," which one particular song would just get me every single time. But then several years later, out of nowhere, driving along, listening to a Sigur Rós song, it just suddenly everything just washed over completely. I mean, it was unsafe. I couldn't see the road. I was bawling my eyes out so much. And so this idea that those moments where you just kind of stop and have a pause and a moment, because you're just getting on with stuff, they're very cathartic and they're very therapeutic, but they're also quite dangerous. So those are the moments where everything can rise up, and I think music is a real trigger for that. I'm now going to get on to some of the theoretical underpinnings of the project before rounding off with The Night a Spanish Doctor Called. So, as I've kind of already suggested, neat linear portrayals of grief are or tend to be ubiquitous in the classical narrative structure of fiction film. And these portrayals, I think, are perhaps supported by the still pervading misreading of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's theory of grief as 5 distinct stages, which culminates with acceptance. Now, Kubler-Ross's seminal approach to grief has been understood in far more simplistic and continuous terms than was intended, despite the author cautioning against a rigid or linear interpretation in the original text, noting that the different stages that people go through when they're faced with tragic news will last for different periods of time and will replace each other or exist at times side by side. So it was never supposed to be a kind of a linear progression of stages. But wider understandings of grief in the last half a century have tended to be based more on broad, generally accepted assumptions rather than on grief literature. And these assumptions include grief being, following a relatively distinct pattern along the lines of the misinterpretation of Kubler-Ross's model. Ideas that grief is relatively short-term and finite, like, yes, you'll be sad for a short while, but you'll get over it, you'll move on. Grief is a quasi-linear process characterized by stages or phases or tasks or processes. You can work through your grief. And also, I think perhaps most dangerously, that the continuation of grief is abnormal and even pathological. Now, the timeframes on this vary depending on which study you read, or kind of historical studies. But as early as 6 months, if you're still feeling sad 6 months afterwards, then it's become pathological and you need a medical intervention. I mean, like, not that was the most severe, but this is the kind of this is characteristic of some of these kind of broader societal views of grief. And Breen and O'Connor neatly surmises this, saying the prevailing construction of grief, endorsed by laypersons, mass media, and many service providers, which is perhaps most troubling, remains a stage-based reaction where recovery occurs within a relatively short time frame, where there are normal and abnormal reactions to grief, and continued attachment to the deceased is pathologized. And this, I think, is really quite worrying. The fact that Breen and O'Connor, in this huge study they did in the early 2000s, found that this was actually an issue with a lot of service providers, by which they mean grief therapists and counsellors, that are still kind of basing a lot of their support on this stage-based approach to grief. So prioritizing. So yeah, while the kind of broader societal perceptions and understandings of grief are kind of beyond the scope of this project, accounting for cinema's construction of grief along the lines detailed on the slide here could be explained by its quite neat alignment with classical narrative structure. So prioritizing linear arcs, cause and effect progression, and coherent, satisfying conclusions, classical storytelling structure provides quite a logical vessel within which to portray characters experiencing progressive stage-based reactions in relatively short time frames, where a sense of acceptance or detachment from the deceased is ultimately achieved. So the idea that grief is ever concluded is now actually largely disregarded, but it's still regularly portrayed this way in cinema. And while the inaccuracy of this representation can be explained by the needs of storytelling structure, the pervasiveness of this portrayal as a linear and finite experience is not, as I kind of suggested at the start, a harmless one, as it can offer a picture of grief that doesn't correspond. So within grief theory discourse, a more nuanced and multifaceted understanding of the complexities of grief, thankfully, presides. So, and one of the most widely accepted kind of frameworks or understandings of grief is the dual process model, which was proposed by Margaret Stroop and Henk Schut. In the late 90s, early noughties. Their model understands grief as a dynamic process of oscillation that moves between loss and restoration oriented coping, a juxtaposition of confrontation and avoidance of different stresses associated with bereavement. So rather than grief being linear and finite, Stroop and Schut proposed that it should be understood as this perpetual back and forth process, what they coined a dual process, where at times the bereaved will be confronted by their loss, and at other times they'll avoid memories, be distracted, or seek relief by concentration on other things in order to cope with what is most often a fundamentally life-altering experience. And this model was developed by reflecting on the recorded experience of bereaved individuals from numerous grief studies, where it was evident that as harrowing and painful as grief is, it is not a constant state of being. At times, grief is overwhelming and disorientating and unbearably distressing, and experiencing these loss-oriented emotions is the bereaved individual confronting the stresses associated with grief. But equally, bills still need to be paid, dependents need to be cared for, work and social relationships continue, life goes on. And not only are these daily tasks a necessity of life admin and human interaction, they're also, Stroop and Schut contend, essential for the grieving process, as they provide moments of restoration and avoidance of the stresses associated with grief, behavior which is required to begin even contemplating a life without the deceased. The frequency and ratio of these oscillations are themselves also not constant. In the immediate aftermath of a bereavement, it would be expected that the grieving individual would have more frequent and acute engagement with loss-oriented activities and behavior as they come to terms with the magnitude of their loss. And as time passes, it would then be expected that the balance would start to tip towards restoration-oriented activities. And the shift is neither constant nor ever completed, though. Anniversaries, triggering experiences, and pure happenstance can propel an individual into a loss-oriented state following an extended period of restoration. And the nature of this loss-oriented state will also morph and evolve over time. And the process never ends. The severity of this oscillation will in most cases dissipate, and the rhythm of it shift to prioritize restoration over loss. But there's no suggestion that grief for a loved one is finite or ever completed. So Colin Murray Parkes, who a British psychiatrist and author of numerous books on grief and bereavement. He's also the writer of the often quoted phrase, "Grief is the price we pay for love." He popularized the application of the concept of the assumptive world to grief. And for Parkes, the assumptive world is the world which we assume to exist on the basis of our experience up to this moment of time, in time. And it's essential to an understanding of what happens to people when they experience a bereavement, because major life changes, particularly those for which we are unprepared, shatter and necessitate major revision of the assumptive world. So what he's saying is that when we're faced with grief and traumatic loss, the assumptions or beliefs that ground or secure or stabilize and orient people are shattered. And in their place, the grieving individual experiences a profound disorientation or anxiety or even panic, which, by the way, are all physical embodied states of being. As the security of their beliefs has been aborted. And this is where phenomenology picks up or has a crossover with grief theory, because reflecting on Murray Parks's concept of the assumptive world, but also on the writings of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, phenomenological philosopher Matthew Radcliffe writes of grief, there is a profound sense of being lost. It's not that the right path cannot be discovered, but there is no path to follow and nowhere familiar to retreat to. There is no fact of the matter concerning how things fit together, no pattern, nothing to specify what is to be done. Catherine Higgins builds on this point further, and she says, profound loss catapults the bereaved person into an alternate world that differs in marked ways from the world we usually occupy. An alternate world lacking, and I actually can't see the rest of that quote because it's been blocked by my window, but I think you get it. I hope you can see it. Yeah, so there's essentially the initial and the immediate aftermath of a bereavement is pure chaos. Any sense of kind of rational or logical experience goes out the window. And this also, I think, chimes very well with this oscillation between loss and restoration oriented behaviors and activities. And an example of that was in Nothing Echoes Here, where she's in the laundrette. She's still needing to, and for those who don't know the story, she's taken her children out of the family home and they're living in a tent in the woods for a period of time. So she's kind of taking them to school, but she's then washing their clothes in a laundrette. She's attending to restoration oriented activities. Life goes on. And then the moment that she stops and listens to some music, it triggers something, and she is then propelled into a loss-oriented moment where she really kind of faces the grief in quite a profound and overwhelming way. Now, I'm going to attempt to draw a link from the grief theory to phenomenology to, and please bear with me, Gilles Deleuze. Now, I know he's not everyone's cup of tea, he's not everyone's favorite, but sometimes he's very, very helpful. And I think that he provides a really interesting bridge here, because the phenomenological understandings of grief that I've just talked about, that Matthew Radcliffe has written and explored, aligns very neatly, I think, with Gilles Deleuze's writing on the time image and the any space whatever, in which Deleuze describes characters in cinema who find themselves in a situation that's beyond any possible action, to which they can't react. It's too powerful, it's too painful, it's too beautiful. The sensory motor link is broken. Now, to me, that sounds like the perfect description of the immediate aftermath of a bereavement, of the overwhelming, disorientating physical nature of a traumatic grief. And for Deleuze, when he talks about the sensory motor link, he's associating this with cause and effect narrative structure of classical, or what he called the action image cinema, and breaking the sensory motor link allows situations of infinite possibility to occur, no matter how painfully for the characters involved. Now, he wasn't looking at characters who were experiencing literal, I guess they were kind of actually experiencing literal grief, but he was looking at, post-war European cinema, Italian neorealism, French New Wave, these aimless, disoriented characters wandering around in the kind of in post-war Europe, in which the sensory motor link had been broken. Now, I think the relevance to portrayals of those grieving a traumatic loss is considerable here, because in this state, in this time image state, in the any space whatever that Gilles Deleuze talks about, identity and meaning remain part of an indeterminate possibility. So with the shattering of their assumptive world, bereaved individuals are required for the rest of their lives to integrate their grief into a new identity. So when Deleuze talked about the time image, he talked about the emergence of these any space whatevers. And when he was talking about was, if you take away the need for a cause and effect linear narrative structure, and suddenly the linkages between scenes and between spaces can be put together in an infinite number of ways, you find yourself with a space of a pure, what he called a pure locus of the possible. And I think that you can apply this to this period of immediate bereavement, where your assumptive world is shattered. There is no path, and there is a temporary state of pure potential, because what grief discourse and phenomenology, and I'm arguing Deleuze, all concur on, is that grief changes you. You don't get over it. You don't work through it. You absorb it. It becomes part of a new identity. And so Joan Didion, the difference between grief as we imagine it and grief as it actually is, which also probably talks about, it speaks to the way in which grief has been portrayed. Talks of the unending absence that follows, the void, the very opposite of meaning, the relentless succession of moments during which we will confront the experience of meaninglessness itself. So grief changes us. It sits within us indefinitely, and rather than being processed, accepted, or concluded, instead, it needs to be incorporated into the construction of a new assumptive world. In the immediate aftermath of a bereavement, when the assumptive world is shattered but not yet rebuilt, the grieving individual exists in a pure locus of the possible, where their post-bereavement identity and sense of self is undefined and unknown. And it's this space, I think, I've concluded, or I've come to, is the one that I've been seeking to explore in the 3 films that I've made as part of this project. And the third of which of these is The Night a Spanish Doctor Called. Now, this film was shot in late 2023 and is currently in the final stages of post-production. Now, where Lost Property was interdisciplinary and collaborative, and Nothing Echoes Here was fictional, but informed by auto-ethnographic reflections on the experience of grief, The Night a Spanish Doctor Called is an autobiographical reenactment of the night that my dad. The film has an entirely subjective perspective, written by me, based on my recollection of the events and the emotional, physical, and psychological experience of that 18-hour period. It was, I should say that, so my dad died late the night before my daughter was born, which was, and he was abroad, so I couldn't kind of leave. I couldn't travel because my daughter's been born the next day, which all kind of threw it into this very kind of complex and slightly kind of, well, even more chaotic experience than it might otherwise have been. So while the central character in the film is given the name Will, he's absolutely a cipher for me, just as other characters in the film are ciphers for real people who were also present and impacted by this experience, which made for a slightly odd conversation with the actor who plays Will the first time I spoke to him about the project, and but luckily he was on board. So the auto-ethnographic approach to experiencing the immediate aftermath of a sudden and unexpected bereavement led me to explore a non-linear vignette approach to the editing of the film. Because I'm attempting to reconstruct the events, or construct the events as they are recalled and re-experienced by me. So I don't remember the night and the following morning in a coherent or a chronological order. I remember moments, I remember looks and sensations in quite a kind of discombobulating manner. And I've attempted to translate this as accurately and authentically as possible, with little to no consideration for narrative continuity, coherence, or linear arcs in the film. But alongside this, however, and this is where this third film differs from the other two, sorry, a second version of the film is being edited by a colleague of mine at the University of Birmingham. This colleague has no knowledge of the night being portrayed in the film. They've not read the script. They weren't involved in any aspect of the pre-production or the shoot. Instead, they've only received the identical raw, unedited footage and sound that myself and the crew captured, and they're attempting to construct a story from this footage based on as much as it's possible to be objective, an objective appraisal of the material, with the intention first and foremost of creating a compelling and engaging dramatic narrative. So the intention is then to play the two versions of the film at a number of screenings, gathering qualitative feedback from audiences who won't be told which version is edited by who and which version they're watching, on the effective impact of each film. The feedback, along with textual analysis of the two versions of the film, will then inform a reflexive evaluation of the process involved in the creation of the two films and the relative merits of each approach, both subjective and objective, in relation to representing grief in an empathetic fashion. Now, I'm going to play a clip from the film. I was then going to talk about some of the kind of creative decisions I took, but I think actually I'll maybe just leave that, and that might fold into any questions or discussion, because I'm aware it's past.
No, please go ahead. You can take more time, Jamie, because it's fascinating. So if you feel like you want to talk about it, that would be great. If not, I will ask you that as a question anyway. So
yeah, okay, all right, okay then. Well, look, I'm gonna play a clip from the film. It's a clip from the very start of the film, and it's I should stress this is from the assembly edit. It's got a very rudimentary grade put on it. I am not a color grader in any way, shape, or form. It's a preset which I've just popped on it. It's had no sound design. And it has already undergone an extra kind of trim and finesse edit, which I haven't yet exported. And basically, like every good student approaching a deadline, I'm getting my excuses in early. Okay, please take this with that in mind. This is not the final version of the film, but anyway, I would say I hope you enjoy, but obviously it's not going to be that enjoyable. I didn't say in the previous one actually, like in terms of like trigger warnings. Obviously, it's about grief, it's about death, and there is a scene here in a hospital which may be a little bit. It's not a pleasant watch. There's no gore, there's no kind of blood or anything like that, but just to give, I guess, fair warning. Okay, here we go.
How long does it reckon?
2 hours. I'll leave at 12.
Do you want a cup of tea?
Coffee might be better.
Sorry, I need to pass you over a second.
Hello. Yes, I'm his son. Fuck. No, fuck.
Hello. This is Emily, George's daughter. Okay.
happened. I thought he was stable. We were told he was stable. So what exactly happened between then and now?
Just doing the final preparations, and then we'll get you right next to Helen.
Okay.
She's doing really well, and the baby's happy.
Okay, thank you.
Helen, I'm going to put some sticky pads on your right thigh, so it might be a little bit cold. And I'm going to move your legs slightly, so I can put some stones on, so there's more blood flow. Okay, is that all right?
Blood pressure went through. Okay.
With those well, is that okay?
Okay, so that was a clip from the opening of The Night Spanish Doctor Called, and yeah, I guess so. If you're sure, just another couple of minutes, actually, I'll just to so a couple of the kind of the creative decisions, I guess, and some of the ways that I was attempting to explore some of the ideas I had about how film language could be used in a filmmaking context to try and convey an empathetic portrayal of grief. So I guess in narrative construction, in this film in particular, so it's very much a vignette-like approach, which is I'm attempting to construct the film in a way that mirrors the way that I have remembered the events of that 18-hour period. But obviously that is I'm making the film now, which is almost 12 years after my dad died. So it's memory filtered through 12 years of, so that there is something that I need to kind of explore and think about there. But it is subsequently structured in quite a chaotic and fragmented manner. I chose this clip here because it was really important to me that I wanted to try and visualize the kind of the visceral imagined death of my dad in the operating theatre, because the thing is, I don't actually know how my dad died. I don't know what the last kind of the final minutes or period of his life was. I know that he was in a hospital in the Canary Islands in Spain, but that's it. And I know what he died of, but I don't know that pads were put on him. I don't know that they tried to revive him in that way. I realized that as I was sat in the operating theatre the next morning, watching my daughter being, born by cesarean, I was having these imagined visions of what my dad must have looked like. And in each one, he was wearing different clothes and he was a different colored clothes. It was a different level of chaos. But I also realized, and it took me a while to kind of not think that I was just being horrible in thinking this. I was viewing it as though it was an episode of ER. Like, I was seeing the chaos. I was seeing this frantic, and there's going to be ADR and lots of Spanish voices on that sequence. But I was seeing this kind of, clear, put the paddles on. We're losing him. All of this stuff, and I was like, I have absolutely no idea that that's how he died. I'm just imagining that because that's my frame of reference. Is a very I've watched too many films, I've watched too much TV, and but I guess that almost kind of reinforces the whole point of this project is that actually what we watch matters, and what we watch informs our own experience of life. And a lot of the time that can be quite kind of irrelevant or irreverent, but actually sometimes it really matters because it impacts how we experience the most profound moments in our lives. So there's a kind of a lot of auto-ethnographic reflection going on there. Again, the handheld camera, very kind of oppressive cinematography, really tight close-ups, really shallow depth of field. I wanted that really kind of a subjective kind of cinematography. Although I do also in this film use a lot more. This is the first film where I use a tripod at any point. I've been allergic to tripods in all of my filmmaking, but I did actually finally use tripods in this because it seemed this oscillation between these kind of loss and restoration moments, these moments of calm, these moments of just numbness, and then these moments of chaos and imagined drama. And yeah, and also completely unlike Nothing Echoes Here, which was all exterior space, because I was really trying to explore this idea of the any space whatever and these unfamiliar exterior alien spaces, which could be these sites of pure potential. This is the complete opposite. It's very interior, it's very claustrophobic, it's very dark. There's only one scene in the film that takes place outside, and chronologically that happens before any of the events of the film. And so it's quite different in that sense. Yeah, so I think I'm going to wrap up there and have the obligatory thank you slide. And apologies if that got a bit rambling at some points.
No, thank you so much, Jamie. I almost have no words in terms of expressing how absolutely fascinating this presentation was, and I am so grateful that you could make it. I have so many questions. There's no way we can squeeze all of them in the next 20 minutes, but I very much hope we can continue this conversation. So first of all, just really incredible how you managed to put so many layers in this work, and how, you know, the very reason I started this seminar is to help people who look at different examples of creative practice work to think how they can start thinking about it. And what you presented here today is just really incredible, because at the same time it's incredibly complex in a good way, but at the same time it's very simple because you came from a necessity, as I understand it, and you just, you know, being a filmmaker, reacted to the situation that happened to you in a creative way and also in academic way, which is also, you know, quite incredible how you put these two things together. But what I really wanted to perhaps ask you is in relation to your last film, which I find utterly fascinating, really, and this idea of having someone else who's obviously not going to have this auto-ethnographic experience, as you said, to have an alternative edit. I think it's just incredible, because you really, if you were to think about it in terms of research questions, which we all are asked to do at some point working within academic context, it really is just the perfect way to respond to this idea, or how do we have an authentic representation of such a complex phenomenon as grief, which obviously is going to be very attached to your experience, to the way you felt and experienced that. And it was just so fascinating to hear you talk about all this, you know, kind of tactile, embodied experience of that, and how different it really is from films where things are very simplified and sometimes just in a not very useful way. So could you talk a little bit about this idea of what do you think is going to happen with these two edits? Because I know you don't know it yet, but I'm just, how much, you said the person doesn't know much about the situation, but they know the skeleton of the story, obviously, because they know they know more or less what happened. What else? Yeah. What else can you tell us? Yeah.
Yeah, they do, and it is a weird one, because and it might turn out to be a terrible idea. I don't know. I don't think you will.
Well,
I don't know. The one thing I have kind of struggled with slightly is the sense that have I just turned something a really traumatic experience into a gimmicky experiment. And this is what I'm really hoping it's not. But I guess they, everyone is hypercritical of their own work anyway, all of the time. And I think then even more so when it's based on things that have actually happened. I'd be really interested to see what the different responses are. I have a sense that, my worry, I guess, with my version of the film is that it'll be too idiosyncratic and too kind of indulgent, not necessarily in a negative way, but because I kind of have to be almost completely for the conceit of this to work. I have to be completely detached from any sense of narrative coherence.
Yeah.
And I have to, it is purely based on my recollection of those events. And that is something that is so personal that will that be helpful or engaging for anybody? But then at the same time, I'm kind of unashamedly a bit of a, I know it's not fashionable anymore, but I still think, auteurist approaches to cinema, and to the creation of art are really important. And we are drawn to particular artists, and we are drawn to the way that they see the world, or the way that they the way that they interpret the world and process it. And so I kind of feel, well, if I'm going to do that, that's what I have to do. I think what it's even more interesting is the extent to which the film will be different, the other version. Because I mean, the person who's doing it, I do know them very well. I actually originally asked them if they would edit the film because I wasn't sure that I would be able to, because of how close it was, and they were like, no, not a chance. But they were also like, well, look, no one is going to edit that film for you. It's your story. There is absolutely no way. And then we were chatting, and then it was the idea of, well, what about if there was another version of it? Don't send me the script. Don't tell me what happened that night. I mean, he knows he knows my dad died, my daughter was born. He knows that. But he's also a film lecturer. Who has a fondness for art house cinema and independent cinema. So the thing I'm almost most worried about, but I'm almost kind of thinking is the most likely outcome, is that we end up producing something that looks remarkably similar. In which case the whole thing kind of, I don't know what conclusions I'd be able to draw from that. So the short answer is I have no idea. But I'm very excited about terrified about what they might end up looking like.
No, I do think it's a fascinating, exercise, and it makes me think. It was also very interesting, and it relates to your answer really about how the way we perceive reality, whether this is, a question of grief and bereavement, or just really about anything, is so personal to everyone. It's so very different. And this scene you showed us, the last scene, when you were imagining what happened to your dad, this is what we do. When we think about some situations, when we think about people we care about, or just people in general, we obviously imagine things we haven't witnessed, and I think that's how we function. But it's not really explored in cinema that much. I cannot really think of many examples that do this. And I think this is really where these two versions can really provide a very, very interesting answer to how do you even depict things which are so personal. And I really also like the idea of how you work with this slightly experimental way of editing that, and how you rely on your own memories, because that's exactly how, again, we relate to things. There's no way, I mean, my memory is horrible. I barely remember what I did yesterday, and somehow I managed to function. But it's just so fascinating to think about that in terms of film language and storytelling. And he's still making a feature film. It was going to be a feature. How long is the film?
Oh, so no. So this film is this is only going to be I think it'll probably be about 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Okay.
The idea is to, once this film's been made, both films have been screened. I've gathered some information, reflected on them. I'll take the kind of the the conclusions and some of the reflections on all three films and the process in the entire project, and then try and filter that into an idea for a feature film, which would hopefully round off the entire project. Yeah, but that's, funding dependent.
Brilliant. Yeah. Well, there is a question about funding I have for you in a second, but I just wanted to go back to this idea. You started, when you talked about your first film, about how you did some interviews and how you had visual artists involved and grief professionals, and you've mentioned how it was the question whether it's going to be three different views or more than three, like different views from different points of view depending on your expertise, or whether this is going to actually contribute to something which is more universal. And what was the answer? I mean, did you find there was a lot of overlap between people looking from those perspectives, or were they very different?
Yeah, no, it was quite different. That was a really interesting process, and I would say actually I can send you that we have written about it. We co-authored a kind of a reflective piece about it from our different perspectives, and it was because there was very much a very positive, a very kind of friendly, creative tension going on, because. So my colleague Liesel, who's in the English department, was coming at it very much from a creative writing perspective. And so it was all about dialogue. And it was all about the interplay and the rhythm of words. And it was about exploring grief through dialogue, but also through objects. There was a particular emphasis on objects. I was very much keen to explore the more kind of the more visual and kind of poetic elements, I guess, and a less of a dialogue focus. And Natasha, I think, was probably even kind of further in that direction than I was. And so we worked on the script together as the three of us. And we got it to a place where we were all happy, and then Natasha and I directed it. And in the end, what we decided to do was I directed the scenes that were conversations that had dialogue between actors, because I'd had experience of directing films and directing actors before, and Natasha took the scenes which were far more, didn't have actors in them or didn't have dialogue in them, and there were these more haptic moments of like a focus on sanding the boat or chopping up a shed, or the slow motion moments at the funeral scene and the screaming and those. So she directed those moments, and it in a completely, I guess, counter to what I said about an auteurist approach, it kind of really worked, because there was these kind of three different focuses, these three different perspectives that did come together and kind of create the finished film. I think from my perspective of this kind of empathetic aesthetic, and I'm more interested in the kind of the visual aspects of film language, and also sound design. The film, Nothing Echoes Here and Spanish Doctor are doing more of the things that I wanted to explore. But I'm really glad that I made that film first with Liesel and Natasha, because it stress tested a lot of those ideas, but also kind of questioned and kind of really made me consider some of the ideas I was having and whether or not they were the most applicable and whether or not they were the best approach. So, but I do like working collaboratively as well. So that was quite fun. Yeah, I enjoyed that.
It is an interesting thing. I mean, I really don't think you should feel bad in any possible way about having this author approach, because, I think this is, if you think again about what you're doing with your films, you're trying to explore something which is unexplored. How else would you do it? Like, I mean, you cannot use an existing template, and because it's absolutely fascinating. Really, really also love how one project leads to another. Really, really, I cannot wait to see where it's gonna take you, with this film and what's gonna follow. But I have another question to do with practicalities of it. So obviously, you mentioned funding. I definitely want to ask you about time, but before I ask you about these two things, I know we had conversations outside of this meeting about time and, or rather lack thereof. But also about where do you think films like that belong when it comes to audiences? Where do you think you can find a place? Where should they be shown? And where, because obviously there's so many people that would love and benefit from watching them. And because you, again, I hate saying that you kind of you sit between different things, but what I'm trying to say is like you can really please so many people with this kind of, so obviously people who need to watch films like that because they're grieving, academics who are dealing with creative practice research. I mean, so many other audiences. So I don't know if you have an answer, or is it just, yeah.
Yeah, it's tricky because then there's also the kind of the industrial concerns, and my desire to have films that I make play at film festivals,
Yeah.
and for my own kind of filmmaking ego and that. But I guess I mean we're lucky that I think we exist at a time where practices research and I put a lot of emphasis on the work that you're doing here as well. That practice research is becoming it's becoming so much more kind of known and accepted as a methodology, and having sites like peer-reviewed sites like Screenworks and In Transitions and a number of other places, there is now a space for them. So Nothing Echoes here is on Screenworks, for example, with the accompanying research statement. So it can be seen, well, technically could be seen by anybody. I imagine it's largely being seen by academics. Lost Property is on the Good Grief channel. So the Good Grief is a festival that was set up 5 years ago. It's set up in Bristol, but that has very much a kind of an international scope. It runs every year, and they have a channel that is free to access, and they host a lot of different materials on there. They with some really big names. Like Julia Samuel is interviews with Julia Samuel, and lots of kind of famous actors and personalities. And the film is on there. I'm hoping that they're also going to then host Nothing Echoes here, and that in a way is finding exactly the audience that I would like the films to find. People who have both a personal experience of and an interest in grief, and in a discussion of grief, because essentially that's what it boils down to, is that and this is why Good Grief was set up, is that we don't talk about grief. We don't talk about death. We all know it's going to happen. We all know we're going to experience it, and maybe that it is proving to be quite damaging to not be talking about it, and that happens in loads and loads of different forms, and that just happens to be that the form I'm exploring is cinema, and fiction cinema in particular. So I think though there are different avenues, there are different places. Nothing Echoes here has played at a number of conferences, both in the UK and abroad. So it's found a bit of an academic audience that way. And it also has played at some film festivals as well. But I guess also, we also accept that short films don't tend to get seen by lots of people, unless they get big kind of award success. So it is a challenge. It is a kind of something you're fighting against a little bit.
Yeah, and as I hear you talk about it, I really think they should. They should be really going beyond the circle of just people who work with creative practice research or film-based research, because they're just so important. I really also loved how you were talking about, this concept and how it's explored in more mainstream cinema, how grief is something that just ends at some point, and and it's just nonsense. I mean, there's nothing really in life that can just, and equally traumatic, even less so, that just ends, because also it relates to the way how you edit your film, this idea of memories and how we function. It's not that something just ends and you move on and forget about it. You don't. And I really love the idea of how you explore it through the actual film language. And I said it already before, but it's just so interesting how, and I completely agree with you, how mainstream cinema can be actually pretty damaging, making you feel like there's something wrong with you when you're actually, dealing with something so human and so natural, and as you rightly say, it's something that every single one of us will have to deal at some point. It's just really incredible. Made me realize. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, No, I was just going to say. I mean, there are. It's not that there aren't any films that are doing this, doing what I'm talking about. So the stills that I included in the slides there, things like Three Colors Blue and
Yeah.
The Babadook and Vital and Morven Caller and After Sun. These are, but you're right. They're not mainstream films.
Yeah.
They're not kind of they. And this is the thing: is as soon as you need to impose quite a strict narrative structure, it does tend to kind of butt up against like that authentic portrayals or experiential, phenomenologically informed portrayals of grief.
Yeah, I'm aware of the time and I don't want to keep you much longer, but I do want to ask one last question, if that's okay with you. So that would be to do with time and funding. So I know, and I feel awful about it, and I'm actually planning to do something about it. The moment I started, being more engaged in kind of more academic type of work, I just literally have no time to actually make anything, and I really want to. So how do you manage to do this? How do you manage to have time and actually, mindset to get some funding and actually keep making films?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, well, one is that it doesn't happen quickly. So, I mean, I've made 3 films, but the first of those was shot in 2019. So that, it's taken 6 years and I've still not finished the third one. So it doesn't happen quickly. I've only been able to make the films during periods of research leave. And I'm aware that I'm very fortunate to be at an institution where you can apply for research leave for one teaching block in 7. So every 3.5 years, if you've got a project on the go and there's a suggestion that you'd be able to get some funding, then that affords you the time to do it. It does very much put a bit of a kind of a stopwatch on the go, though, because especially, I mean, Spanish Doctor was the most involved logistically, because we had to recreate an operating theatre. We cast quite a well-known actor and had to arrange for them to come down from London, and that was and so the funding aspect of it is the other thing. And again, I'm lucky that within the institution that I'm in, there is a research centre which is has its focus is on the interaction of kind of arts and health, and in innovative approaches to research. So they've been a really big supporter, and it's been funding from so it's the Brigstow Institute, and it's been funding from them that has allowed me to make all 3 of these films. But as you say, when I put in the pitch to you for giving this talk, I was very confident I'd have a completed film. I'll have done the screenings. I'll have all of the reflections, all of the kind of the feedback to be able to say. And I still haven't done post-production on it because, term starts, new roles change, you get new things come in, new responsibilities, and suddenly there just is no time. And life gets in the way. I was just telling you beforehand, I've moved house and moved my children to different schools and things. And so, luckily, I think I've been, I think it's now my 9th year at the institution that I'm at. I'm just starting to get to the point where I don't ritualistically beat myself up when I don't get things done quickly enough, because there isn't a lot of time. It's hard to get stuff done. It's hard to find money, but you've just kind of got to make sure that you really enjoy it when you do, because if you're just thinking, oh, finally, why is it taking me so long? Where am I going to find the next money? Where am I going to find the next time? How am I possibly going to edit this? You realize you go through the whole process and you go, oh, wait a minute, I just made a film and I didn't actually stop to enjoy it. And I had to really, and with the Spanish Doctor, I really had to kind of forcibly, I'm going to get all my therapy speak out now, the mindfulness and stuff. But I really genuinely had to be like, occasionally just go, this is really cool. Oh my God, how lucky am I? I'm making a film right now. And so you do, but I know I probably won't get a chance to do another one for another couple of years at least. And this one is going to be edited in and around, everything else. So it's probably still not going to be ready for a few months. But that's okay. And I think that's it. You just have to tell yourself that that's okay.
Yeah, I think it's a great attitude. It really is. Yeah. No, brilliant. Thank you so much, Jimmy. As I said, I have probably bazillion of other questions, but hopefully we can continue this conversation. I have to apologize about my really red face. I am about to suffocate. We had a conversation with Jimmy before. I'm currently in a very unusual place. So I'm at a BAFTS conference at the university of work, and I'm in some kind of bunker with no air, so my face has been just really red. I'm just trying to keep hydrated. Sorry if I look
You've
like
done
that.
so well, Agatha. Yeah, I'm very impressed. You've done an hour and a half in an oven. So well done.
It is an oven. So once again, million times thank you, Jimmy. I'm going to put it online probably later tonight. And it was absolutely a pleasure. It was just really so lovely to have you here. And thank you so much for absolutely fantastic talk. It's been just wonderful. And best luck with the film. And
thank you very much.
To see what you're going to do afterwards. But hopefully more about it soon.
Thank you very much. And again, I mean, I will say one more time. I think that the Rebellious Research series, the seminar series that you've set up, is just fantastic, and it's such a good resource. And I think you're a real kind of pioneer for practice research, and we're all very grateful to you for that. So
thank you so much, Jimmy. So lovely of you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, and speak to you soon. Bye.